So we're going to look at, this is point of view part 2, because I wanted to look at some ways that you can use point of view to add a little more depth or complexity to your story. As I've mentioned in class, I like it when people experiment, but also keep in mind, if your goal is to be traditionally published and you're a first-time author, there's a sweet spot where you want to, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but you don't want to experiment too much, because a publisher, let's face it, they're out to make money. They need to know that taking a risk on you and publishing your story is going to pay off. So people need to be somewhat accustomed to the conventions and the style that you're using. So if you're self-publishing, you have less to worry about. Again, the rules come down to, does your reader understand what you're trying to say, and are they continuing to turn the pages? And as I mentioned in class, everything that we now think of as like a rule or a style, everything that's a thing required somebody to just start doing it at some point. Like, space opera as a genre didn't exist until it did. And I'm sure that when people were first thinking of this, they were probably told nobody's going to read that because that's not a thing. So, do experiment, play around, see what works, and the ultimate feedback is, can you get readers interested? Do they understand what you're trying to convey? Do they continue to turn pages? Once that happens, you've got something. If you come up with something and it's so, brilliantly unique, and you're like, oh, there's nothing like this out there, and the reason there's nothing like that out there is because nobody can understand it, that's a different story. So we talked about point of view, and I mentioned that some people will do, and I've done this before too, a different perspective, like maybe 2 or 3 characters whose points of view alternate with each chapter. And some people call that like a braided narrative, because you're getting a couple different sides of the story. Some examples of that I really love are Ken Follett with the Century trilogy. Fall of Giants, I think, was the first one in that. So it's there's like 4 or 5 different families, and that's an ambitious number of characters, by the way. Actually, it's an ambitious number of different families. So the story is events in the lives of characters from these 4 different families, like around the world, leading up to World War I, and during World War I. And then his second book in that series is World War II, and the third book is the Cold War, and it's each different generation from these 4 or 5 families. So it's quite ambitious. And it works. In this case, it works, but again, it works because his work is very much character-driven. You get so engrossed in the lives of these families that the fact that, the Battle of the Somme is going on is like background noise. It's not even the most interesting thing. It's like, you want to know what's going to happen, to so-and-so and his, family and his kid and his brother and whatever. So he does a really good job of building up 3-dimensional, complex characters. And that's why you want to keep reading it. And that's why it's not confusing, because there's a very clear distinction between, and I don't recall all the names because I'm just bad with names, but there's a very clear distinction between the family living, on the Welsh countryside, and the family that, comes to Buffalo from Russia, and there's very clear, these are very, the German family, there's very well-developed characters. So if you're doing that kind of narrative where you alternate points of view, your reader has to have a clear sense that character A is very different from character B. And that's something that you just, I'm learning that. I've learned that by practice. I'm still learning that. That's something you learn by doing. Some people are really gifted with character portrayal, but again, this is something that the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. So, just keep writing. So another example is a book that I mentioned in class called Fantastic Land by Mike Bakavin. And this is the work of fiction that it's told in an investigative journalistic style, which is very interesting. I like that. But of course, because there's a different person being interviewed, you get a different perspective with each chapter. So if you do it that way, it helps to signal to your reader, how will they know that you're going from character A to character B? The easiest way, in addition to obviously changing their personality, so it's very clear that character A's voice is very different from character B's voice. But the other, very clear way to do that is to label each chapter with who the character is that we're getting their perspective. And so that's what I did in, I don't know if you could see, Murder in the Gilded City, which is the most recent book that I self-published last year in what are we in now? 2022? Okay, so it was in 2021. And I learned, because in other books, I think Quiet Man was close third with alternating characters. And Golden Apple had alternating characters, but there were a lot of characters that were introduced up front. And it was not easy, was the feedback that I got from a lot of people. It was not easy to follow, because it's different to alternate points of view when you've already had like a nice full chapter to really get to know a certain character. It's a whole different thing to alternate points of view with like 2 or 3 pages in between, when you're just getting a glimpse of who that character is and then we switch. So in Murder in the Gilded City, I took a risk and alternated characters within the first chapter, which, is potentially very confusing for a reader. And the way that I did that is there's the date, the location, the time, and the name. And this was very intentional, not just because I wanted different points of view, but because what happens in this opening chapter is there's this big dramatic thing. There's a terrorist attack at a local popular landmark at the Saratoga racetrack. And I wanted the scene to unfold similar to like a suspense movie. Like when the thing is about to happen, and, at first you get, a nice big chunk of the scene where it's kind of casual, nothing's really intense yet, and then the music, if you're watching a movie, the music intensifies, and the scene, you cut closer from, like, this person's dialogue to that person's dialogue, and the pace quickens, and that was what I wanted to recreate in this chapter. So initially, the first character we meet is the protagonist, Jesse. And Jesse's a young kid who shows up at the racetrack to sell pink sheets. It's his summer job. He comes from a working class family, so he's not really on the high end of the, social scene in Saratoga. But, we get to meet him, and we get his perspective, because he's walking to his job, and people are in such a hurry to get to the racetrack, they're almost running him over. Very realistic if you've ever been to Saratoga Springs. And you get a little bit of, it's close third, so you get his reflection on, what he thinks of the people who go there, and he's just there to make his money because he wants to get a car and he wants to get an apartment. So it's very casual at first, and he observes that there's the protesters out in front of the racetrack. And then we switch to Kristen, and there's a timestamp next to that. So you get a sense of time moving. And at first there's, it's kind of like, here's where this person is at this time, here's where this person is at this time, because they're all going to be brought together by this this bomb that goes off. So it's also it's counting down to the bomb. And then, same thing, we introduce Kristen. She's from a more upper class family. She's just, she missed her high school graduation because of COVID and school being shut down. So this is like her consolation prize from her well-to-do family, as she gets to bring her girlfriends to the track for a day, and they're all, kind of, affluent and snotty. And then we meet another character, and then we go back to Jesse, and then we go back to Kristen, and the time frames start to shorten. So there's a sense that something's about to happen, because we're not spending as long with each character. We're kind of getting them set up. And then the time frames between, there's one section here where Jesse has like 3 paragraphs, and time-wise 2 minutes go by, and then we go back to Kristen. And, so it's the reader can tell they're being lined up for something big to happen, and I just kind of gave away what happens. But that's not really a spoiler, because it's sort of the beginning of the story. It's not a turning point or anything. But the idea being that I could have made those separate chapters. but for some reason I just decided not to. But that's a way you can create suspense, is by having multiple points of view and then shorten the time that the reader spends with each one, as if they know they're building up to something. But again, you want to make sure they have distinct personalities, distinct voices. You want to make it as easy as possible for the reader to know who they are currently reading about. And then, so that's the only scene, I believe, in this book where there are multiple points of view in one chapter. That's a risky thing to do. If you don't do it very intentionally, it will look like you don't know what you're doing. So there's a really great book I would recommend. It's called Ohio. I believe the author's name is Stephen Markley, but I always get his first name wrong, so it might not be Stephen. And this is it's a really great, brings in social themes around addiction and the Iraq War and poverty. And there's points in the book where he intentionally switches point of view or goes into flashback. And if you're just kind of casually reading and you're not paying close attention, like I was, because I read it while I was traveling, and I was like sitting at this rest stop really tired and like reading through it, and suddenly I'm like, wait, I gotta go back and reread that part. That was my fault. I wasn't being as attentive as a reader. But just know that if you are going to switch point of view, there's things you can do. Like the format that I use to publish my manuscripts, there's a code you can put in that will put like 3 little asterisks. So you get like not only a space between the paragraphs, but you get like a little symbol that shows you we're going into a different scene, even though it's the same chapter. An easier way to do it is to just do a new chapter or a new section. So when you have more space to do that, you can do the first section of the book from this character's point of view, the second section from that character's point of view. And this can be a fun way to do Unreliable Narrator, or as my partner likes to call them, the Lying Narrator. Because similar to, what is her name? Lucy Foley, I believe her name is, The Guest List, which is another book that I am fond of. It can be fun to have 2 or 3 different characters recount the exact same event, because they're going to have different perspectives. And if you're writing mystery or crime, or even horror, this is where the reader gets character A's perspective, character B's perspective, but here comes character C, and character C knows a secret that character A and character B don't know. So you can make things really interesting that way by doing different points of view, or not. You can keep it all in the same point of view, or most of the book can be in the same point of view, and that's a way to really get to know one specific character. So it has been recommended to me that I limit characters a little bit more, and go deeper into building those characters. So the current works in progress that I have, the current one, Frank from Jersey, is primarily one point of view, although there are some things that I do to try to mix it up. So there's a what appears to be an omniscient narrator that people find out at the end what that narrator is. But it's not alternating point of view every chapter like some of the other things I've written. And so, and I have noticed the difference, because it really does give me a deeper way to get, really a lot more development out of one character. But I would say, again, experiment, play around with it, try different points of view, and try to be interesting about how you introduce them. Other fun things can be, maybe you get a glimpse of someone's diary entry. Maybe they get interviewed. I know someone in class talked about their work in progress. It has to do with someone being interviewed on the radio. I like to use like little newspaper articles as a way to introduce something that's going on, like just a different perspective. So, have fun with how you introduce these different narrators into your story. Thanks for watching.